Happy spring. So I haven't done a video or an email in a while for several reasons. Obviously, I'm a busy mom, but also there's been a lot going on in our industry. So if you know someone or you've been just even paying attention to the news, even your Yahoo alerts on your phone, there's been a big lawsuit that was going on against NAR, so the National Association of Realtors, against certain brokerages for what they essentially were accused by sellers of price fixing or conspiring to keep broker commissions at a certain percentage. There's a lot of misinformation out there. It's really kind of infuriating to even listen to news reporters because a lot of what comes out of their mouth is not even 100% accurate. To be clear, when we go to real estate school, now I've taken real estate school in Texas where I did real estate and then also Arizona. One of the first things that they teach you is that commissions are negotiable. There is not a flat commission. However, as an agent or a broker, you decide what your fees are for the services that you're providing. Now, if you interview a broker and they tell you that they charge, for example, 5%, and you say, well, I'm not really comfortable paying that. What comes with that 5%? And then they go over it with you. And then maybe they might say like, well, if you also buy with me, there's room for negotiation. Or if you want to remove X, Y, and Z services, I can drop that down. So commissions have also always been, a negotiable part of listing a property. There's also, and I can't speak to other states, but apparently there's been some misunderstanding when it comes to listing and what the listing brokerage is charging as to what was getting also paid out to the buyer broker. If you've ever listed or sold a home here in Arizona, our listing agreement specifically states the total compensation for the listing brokerage. And then out of that compensation, what will also be offered to the agent who brings the buyer and represents the buyer. Now, the irony in all of this is if you know anything about real estate history, back in the early 90s, there was not a buyer broker commission that was offered. And the reason we have that now is because of lawsuits where, I'm going to try to put this in as simple terms as possible, but let's just say that Joe decides he wants to sell his house and he hires broker A to list his house. Well, Pete comes walking along and sees the for sale sign in the yard and calls the agent who's listing the property, broker A. He has no agent representing him. He says, hey, I love the house. I want to make an offer. Broker A says, perfect. Well, broker A is already representing the seller. If you think about this, it's very difficult for somebody to 100% have two people's best interests in a transaction like that. So what ends up happening is that broker A does what's called dual agency and becomes more of essentially a paper pusher. They cannot give advice, opinions, etc. to the buyer, and all parties end up having to sign a form basically saying that they agree to this. In Texas, this is highly frowned upon. It's definitely done a lot more here in Arizona. And I think that it is okay if it's a familiar parties who are working together, but it does get very sticky in other instances. So what ended up happening was people were then complaining that, okay, this buyer didn't have anyone on their side who knew how the process worked, the transaction, when that buyer could get out and still get their earnest money back. What is an inspection? What is the timeline? An appraisal? They have no one advocating for them. And thus, out of all this, we then had a buyer broker essentially that was created, and then the buyer broker commission that was offered. And I don't know the logistics of why they decided back then that the seller would pay it, but I do know that if you think about it, there's a very large amount of people purchasing a home who don't have a huge nest egg of funds to be buying. With the way that houses are priced right now, some people coming up with 3.5% is a lot. So maybe the fact is that the commission ends up being wrapped into the price, right? That is paid to the person who represents the buyer. But as far as the seller's concerned, okay, they've already agreed to pay this. And what people don't understand is if you don't have your own representation as a buyer, whatever commission that listing broker took the listing at, let's just say it's 5%. And then their contract, they agreed to pay 2.5 and 2.5. That full 5% gets paid to the listing broker then, if they represent both sides. So are there instances where this may not occur? Yeah, but for the most part, that's where they're now doing the work of two people. So it's funny in a way that this is why we have buyer broker and buyer commission, but now they're wanting to take it away. And essentially what will happen is in July, the buyer broker commission that's advertised to agents on the MLS will come off. What that means for agents is that essentially now when we're working with home buyers, whether or not they have a lot of extra cash or not, the fees that are going to be charged to have someone working for you and to represent you as a buyer all will be discussed now up front, and they'll be required to sign basically an employment agreement saying like, we agree to pay XYZ. Now, are people moving very frantically right now to figure out like, okay, what are the best ways where we can still wrap this into the purchase price of the home, whether that be seller concessions, etc. There will be ways around it, yes. But that's all kind of still being worked through right now. How does this affect sellers? It doesn't really. I think that, to be honest, in the market we're in right now, where houses are already sitting, paying a buyer broker is going to make your property much more desirable, because people who are shopping then know that they don't have to come up with that extra money to pay the agent who's representing them. So they would essentially still be offering it. It just wouldn't be advertised in the MLS, which means that, let's say I'm working with a buyer to help them try to find a home and they're interested in, say, 10 properties. That would just mean me calling the agent up prior to showing the property, since it's not in the MLS, and say, hey, I have a client who's interested in your house. Are you offering buyer broker compensation? Yay or nay? Okay, yes, they are. No, they aren't. Then I relay that information back to my buyer. And if the buyer has the cash, great. And if they don't, perhaps that's just a house that's not an option for them if there isn't a way to make it work. So these are all the things that we're going to be kind of filtering through. What does this mean for buyers? It kind of depends on what kind of buyer you are. So if you're a buyer who is selling and receiving a lot of equity and then, turning around and maybe downsizing or not necessarily needing to use all of that equity, whatever fee that you have negotiated up front, if for whatever reason the home you fall in love with is not offering a buyer broker, then you would just be responsible for bringing those additional funds to closing to pay your representative when you close. If you're someone who is doing, let's say, a VA loan and you don't have a ton of cash, if you are a first-time home buyer and you're struggling just to come up with your down payment, this might just mean that you are only looking at properties now who are offering a buyer broker, because you don't have that extra cash to be able to cover paying for your representation. What does this mean as far as commissions? I don't know. It will be interesting to see how all of this shakes out. If we see more flat rate commissions, flat rate fees, if we still see percentage, maybe they're just different percentages. I don't know how this is all going to shake out. What I do know is that there is a very large misconception in the real estate industry. I think people see something on TV like $1 million listing and things like that, and they see these numbers that these brokers are making on these $23 million houses. And yes, those numbers are insane, right? They're also spending a lot of money marketing, advertising, open houses, doing things on these properties, because those properties are for a very, very specific buyer. So it takes a lot of energy, time, and resources to try to sell a $23 million house, because there's just not as many people who can afford it. Now you take a look at a $400,000 house, and let's say for whatever reason that the commission that was being offered to the buyer broker was 3%. Okay, so $12,000 is essentially what you would see on the settlement statement, which, by the way, buyer broker commissions have always been like, you see them whenever you close on the settlement statement. So maybe you've never asked your agent who's working with you, hey, what are you making? No different than if I go to the doctor's office and ask someone to treat my kid, I'm not asking the doctor, hey, what are you getting paid after the insurance company pays you, right? But if you really want to know, it's on your settlement statement. So let's just I'm just using round numbers. So let's say that the agent was paid a 3% buyer broker commission on a $400,000 house. That's $12,000. Okay, So what people don't understand is then after that $12,000 is paid, it actually goes to the brokerage where the agent hangs their license first. And from that, there's a split that you have to pay your broker to hang your license there, etc. Then after that, you have overhead expenses because we're all self-employed entrepreneurs. So we have things like taxes, insurance, marketing, all these things that come out of that amount that you see. And then please keep in mind that in this industry, the way that this has been set up is that agents do not get paid for showing properties, listing houses until they close escrow. So you could take a list, which I will not take an overpriced listing because it is a waste of time and money, especially in a market like this. But an agent can take a listing with a seller who's unreasonable, overprice it, spend money to take photos, get it clean, do all these things, and the property could never sell, and then that agent gets paid nothing. You can spend time as an agent showing properties to a buyer who never buys a house, and you never get paid for the hours that you have spent showing properties. That's the way this industry works. So there is a risk to it as well. And that is a risk that you take on when you get into this industry. But what people don't understand is okay, so you see a $12,000 commission on a $400,000 house with one client that's closing, but then that money is also covering the hours that may have been spent with someone else that never actually buys. I had a client one time who was moving here from out of state, found a house that they absolutely loved, and ended up changing their mind and deciding to pull out and move to Alabama. I got paid nothing for that. But that's just the nature of the industry. You could have a client fall out at the last minute because they forget and they go open up a credit card for furniture, and all of a sudden they can't qualify for the loan anymore. And you have done everything you can to try to get them to the closing table, and now you don't get paid. So there's all kinds of reasons why things don't close. The majority of the time, as long as everyone's doing what they're supposed to, things run really smoothly, but there's always a risk, right? So when people see these large numbers, what they don't understand is the hours that are also being put in that aren't necessarily with that one transaction or that one deal. And at the end of the day, I just caution and urge everybody to think about the fact that whoever you're working with, you should trust, right? This is literally one of the largest, or if not the largest, financial transaction that you will make in your entire lifetime. If you're not experienced buying, if you're not experienced selling, you should be hiring a professional that's worth the money that you're paying them to get this deal done, and to make sure that they're doing everything in their power to make the transaction run as smooth as possible for you. So whether it's me or someone else, it's fine. I just encourage you to go talk to somebody and get all of the information, specifically if you've been thinking about buying. This is 13 minutes on the current changes that are happening. I will talk very briefly just about the Phoenix market. There's statistics in this email on what's going on. Homes are definitely sitting longer. I would say 3 months is nothing. That's kind of average, 2.5 to 3 months. The biggest thing is price. Price when you're selling is so important. We are not in the same market that we were in 3 years ago where we can push that price, and granted, are there circumstances where that's different? Absolutely. If you're on the lower end of the average price home, which means that there's a ton of people who are qualified for that. If there's not a lot of homes that are for sale, and if your house shows really well, yeah, you might be able to push the price just a little bit, just because the demand for that is going to be a lot higher. But if houses in the neighborhood are sitting, stuff's not moving, especially if it's in an area where normally things don't sit long, and you need to sell, you have got to price it appropriately. And that is why you're hiring someone to give you all of the information. An agent who's going to look at recently solds, days on market, not just the solds as far as what the price point was that they sold her. What does the interior look like? Is there competition that's currently listed? You want to be priced in a desirable area, and you don't want to be chasing the market. I have seen so many houses recently that I just saw 2 cancel. If they would have been priced where they were supposed to be priced right out of the gates, they would have sold. But when you overprice and overlist in a market like this, and then it sits and you're chasing, dropping the price, every 2 weeks to try to get someone in there, people start to look at the days on market and then wonder there's gotta be something wrong. And then people aren't even taking the time to go in and look at it. So Anyways, I'm not gonna keep going. Long video. There's just kind of a lot going on in the industry and a lot to absorb. I'm always here if you have questions. If you want to know more about what's going on, please call me. And if you're thinking about buying or selling, please pick up the phone. I'm happy to talk to you. And I'm the type of person that I'm gonna tell you if now is a good time or not a good time. I'm not just here to close a deal, right? Like if whatever your long-term goal is doesn't fit with listing or buying right now, then maybe now is not the time for you. Anyways, I'm here if you have questions also about vendors, etc. And otherwise I will talk to you soon. Take care.